floor is yours.
Thank you. So my name is Eija Meriläinen, and I'm from the Hamlock Institute in Finland, and it's Humanitarian Logistics Institute. And the paper is a conceptual paper titled "Who Are They, Victims or Survivors?" And this is my first conference presentation, so I hope that you're all going to be relatively kind, and I'll do my best too. So, before going into the paper itself, I want to tell you a little about the background why this paper came to be. So this picture is from Christchurch in 2013, where I lived after, it's 3 years after the devastating 2010 and 2011 earthquakes. And the city was quite deserted, and it wasn't still rebuilt, and there was not too much life going on. And I started my disaster resilience and humanitarian logistics research there. And initially, I was very interested in what could be done in order to support the people who have been affected by disasters. And I was really solution-oriented, top-down approaching as an engineer. But after living in Christchurch and more deeply getting into the topic, I started realizing that I necessarily wasn't asking the right question initially. I wasn't really asking who are the people I'm trying to help, so with my research or help. And because the people affected by disasters are not merely victims portrayed in the NGO's marketing material, neither are they superheroes who put their lives together in a matter of minutes after a disaster. So profoundly, what we are discussing is humans. And for me, thinking about it was important for my research, and because I felt that sometimes in academia, readers and writers drift into ivory tower of abstractions and not necessarily anymore think about who we're addressing with our research. And I wanted to, with this paper, go deeper into what disaster resilience is and what are the assumptions made about the people that are inherent there. And I consider that to be necessary because if we're trying to give voice to the people who need to be given voice to, we need to more think about what we're saying about them and what are you thinking. So with this paper, I'm going to drill a bit deeper into that. And what I did in this paper in general was that I took concepts that are essential to disaster resilience, and from disaster to resilience, and kind of reflected them against what is the assumption there about who is being discussed. And here I have two definitions of a disaster, and they are not the only definitions of disaster that exist. However, they kind of have they agree on something and disagree on something that I think is inherent in the literature in general. So the first one is the UniSDR's definition from 2009, where they define a disaster as a disruption that exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. And this is emphasizing what a community is lacking in the aftermath of a disaster, that they need help. Whereas a differing observation is made by Norris et al. In their paper that communities have the potential to function effectively and adapt successfully in the aftermath of disasters. So what I find important here is that they agree on that there is a hazard that causes an impact into a human community. But they disagree that whether a community needs external resources on recovering from it. And you can see that there are, of course, different definitions. If you would go deeper into disaster relief literature instead of disaster resilience literature, the answer might be different. Whereas when you look at things as a psychologist instead of architect, you might view it differently. You might view empowerment differently, and you might focus on infrastructure instead of psychology. But all the same, I find that if we're talking about these big labels like disaster resilience, understanding that we don't even necessarily agree what we imply with a disaster to the people is important. And next up, going for resilience. So there's a variant in disaster resilience. When you talk about it, it's related to disaster risk reduction, mitigation, adaptation, vulnerability, the list goes on. There's a variety of buzzwords that have changed across the, say, from vulnerability to resilience, I think, most recently. And we're already discussing resilience, so it's already making a choice. However, to understand what has been embedded in the concept, I find the most important concept in this respect is to understand vulnerability. So vulnerability and resilience, they are, by some authors, they are kind of overlapping concepts or almost equivalent, whereas others say that they are kind of at the other ends of the scale. But then there also sometimes vulnerability is viewed as a more static view of characteristics of some community or individuals, whereas resilience can be seen as a kind of general process. However, here I take a bit of a more static view to drill deeper. But in general, resilience and vulnerability, they are considered as characteristics of a community or its setting that define how a hazard turns into a disaster in a context. But one should also understand that this concept of resilience comes from the ecological side of the fence. So it's not necessarily adaptable totally to social situations. In natural sciences, it refers to how a system bounces back to its equilibrium after an external shock. But in the social context, both like the structure and agency matter. So it's not just the system that has one external shock, but there's a lot of boundary conditions that are not similarly necessarily in ecology and exactly the similar matter. Because can people really be resilient, or as individuals or communities, if there are man-made boundaries and structures that stop them, for example, fulfilling their most basic needs? And if you take about, for example, indigenous or some rural communities even, they might be the closest thing that we have to resilience, but they have seen their lands privatized, or their lands. So it should be understood that if one talks ideologically about resilience and thinks about the ecological concept, it's not necessarily valid. And for one example, it can be about the privatization of water. So if people have nothing to drink in the aftermath of a disaster, is it originally a problem of, for example, that general access to water already before the disaster, or a property of the disaster? And one thing that differs is that some people focus on individuals and others on communities. And the community is not it's good to focus on something greater than an individual in the aftermath of disaster, because people recover from disasters as a community. However, in the urban context, you can't really draw a boundary around a social community, because there's not that much a community of place. It's more a community, well, there are a lot of communities that are scattered around across the geographical region. Whereas in the rural context, you can still sort of circulate, there might be a connection to place and connections that arise from the place. And that's kind of the ideological community that people often think about it, but that it has been questioned whether in the urban context you can think about that. But there is a community of practice that arises in the aftermath of a disaster to respond to the disaster. And whereas sometimes when researchers focus on individuals, it's usually a discussion more about individuals of certain characteristics, and then it becomes easily a discussion about vulnerabilities that of groups of, say, women or disabled people in some crisis situations. And whereas usually when the community resilience is brought up, it's about the kind of more positive aspects of the survival of recovering as a whole. And then furthermore, there's like, one should understand that vulnerability, even when you focus on that, it quite often exists from the point of view of the system. So it's like, the vulnerability is not of weaknesses, but that should be totally fixed. Like, being a woman is not a vulnerability. But it should be understood that from in point of view of some certain system, they are more easily displaced and more easily suffer the effects. So one should not only think about what to do in the aftermath of disaster, but how you perceive the system. And furthermore, agency can be exhibited in different ways. So, for example, after Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of media attention on the stayers and the leavers of the city, who in the immediate aftermath either stayed in the city or who fled. And the media was focusing on the heroes who saved their lives and went away, whereas they didn't notice that the people who stayed might not have the resources to do so, that they couldn't escape the city. So what they could choose to do is to live with it, to live with the disaster, help each other, stay there, and like sort of their agency was more of acceptance and living with it instead of controlling it. So thinking about vulnerability and resilience, it's not that there exists one set of victims and another of survivors, but like there are various different ways of recovering and being resilient, and we should, as researchers, not make judgments about what people are exhibiting, but being kind of tuned into it and understanding that everyone is a survivor, and rather support that. And to conclude all of it, so what I wanted to say that with the paper and was that in all levels we make assumptions on what disaster is, what resilience is, and we should, at least I should, go back to who I'm discussing about and from their perspective, and trying to especially not jump into solutions before we understand what we're trying to do with it. And like getting down from the abstract concepts of resilience, etc., down to the human level before going back there to abstractions. And understanding vulnerabilities from the point of view of the current system, and like keeping that in mind and not just fixing the thing that is broken at the moment, but rather kind of taking long-term resilience of the society and communities as a whole. And understanding different kinds of agency and supporting the survivors. And altogether, this is important because while the issues are global, from climate change to all sorts of, let's say, effects of neoliberal markets in the developing states, or all these issues are global. However, research shows again and again that the solutions come from the local level. So then we should really focus on the local solutions, local communities, and see it from their point of view, and rather focus on getting together before trying to get further. And that's something that is important also now, because the Sustainable Development Goals are now being discussed again. And it's a big question whether we can grow out of our problems, or should we kind of tune back into whose problems are we trying to fix, and basically be tuned into ourselves and the others as well. Thank you.